Har I rigtig fundet ud af, hvor aldersgrænsen sådan cirka går?
Ja, det är ljuset.
Ja, fordi du skal ikke bruge...
Jo, jag tänkte det. Jo, det är ganska...
Er den sluttet til?
Nej. Man kan inte bara... Här. Vad ska vi se?
Hvad er det?
Nu är den i alla fall här.
Ja. Så jeg slukker lyset.
Du kan göra det, men det blir för mörkt för jag ska ju läsa. Så att
Ja.
det går att...
Hvad vil du bestemme? Det er fordi...
Ja, nej men pröva gör det. Jo, men det här... Det ska gå bra. Det ska gå bra. Ja, det går bra.
Okay, welcome to the post-lunch session, and our first speaker is Rova, and well, you don't need to note that. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And there should be a handout, and one copy of the text that I'm going to talk about. So there are two different things being distributed. Our strongest proof. Sorry, I begin at the wrong page. Despite its massive impact on the proper founders of Greek philosophy in the 4th century BCE, that is Plato and Aristotle, Parmenides' poem has left many readers perplexed, owing to its arcane mixture of mythical imagery, mystical doctrine, and pure logical reasoning. The original work is usually thought to have consisted of between 300 and 400 hexameter lines. A short introductory section, usually referred to as the Proem, describes the otherworldly journey of a young charioteer. He is escorted by the maidens of the sun to a gated dwelling by the paths of night and day. As the team reaches the gates, the maidens gently persuade the goddess Dike to unlock the gates, and the charioteer is brought into the palace, where he is courteously greeted by an anonymous goddess. The remainder of the work is composed in the style of a divine revelation, the goddess's speech, divided into two major phases, one section on the true reality of being, aletheia, and one on the seeming reality of mortal opinion. Our strongest proof that Simplicius had access to a complete copy of the poem is the alleged scarcity of Parmenides' treatise that he states as an intrinsic argument for painstakingly citing so many of its verses verbatim. Of course, his indispensability as a witness does not make him infallible. Conflicting, variant readings of what is generally held to be the same verses quoted in the works of other ancient authors have led modern editors to assume that Simplicius's version of the poem contained a few false conjectures. Consider, for instance, the variant readings of the programmatic verse 129 or 429, depending on which edition you use, to which I shall soon pay closer attention in its proper context of the mythological Proem. Excluding, this is in your handout also, excluding Proclus's idiosyncratic reading, ev phengios, nominative ev phenges, well radiant, two other variant readings, the two other variant readings, ev paetios, nominative ev paetes, well persuasive, and ev kykleos, from a otherwise unattested nominative ev kykles, well-wheeled or well-rounded, have both been posited on the grounds of sound internal criteria. Hermann Diels proposed a solution to the problem, opting for ev kykleos, that was to remain largely undisputed for more than half a century. At Diels' original suggestion, a critical treatment of the variant should obey the following principles: a majority of witnesses do not decide the verdict. 2. An easier, immediately comprehensible reading is expected to be false, lectio difficilior. And 3. A reading based on direct tradition is expected to be correct. Since the genitive ev kykleos, suggesting an unattested nominative, ev kykles should have appeared awkward in lieu of the regular form ev kyklo, Diels proposed that ev paetios was the result of a conjecture designed to clarify the verse. He also asserted that the ad hoc coinage of an irregular genitive could be explained on metrical grounds as a means to avoid a disfiguring hiatus, ev kyklo atremes. Such a form would also have appeared safe in light of the semantically seamless alternation between forms such as ev ergos, ev erges, well wrought, and ev echos, ev eches, well sounding. From the early 1970s onwards, preferences for the alternative reading, ev paetios, have grown into an almost uncontested editorial standard. This is surprising in view of the fact that the philological arguments typically evoke the relative aptitude of ev paetios in the context of the poem, which Diels, in fact, never sought to disprove, whereas they all fail to persuasively account for the new problems raised by a dismissal of the nonce word ev kykles as a product of creative misreading. We should not underestimate the apparent effect of variant readings gradually designed to make a singular verse appear less ambiguous, save at the increasing cost of semantic dilution. The untrembling heart of well-wheeled truth, which would then be in my opinion, the original reading, the untrembling heart of well-persuasive truth, the exacting heart of well-persuasive truth. To claim that truth is well-persuasive and exacting at its heart seems fairly trivial, referring to it instead as a well-wheeled and potentially rotating whole with an untrembling, otherwise typically beating heart would render a forceful oxymoron, on a par with the ones in the Shakespearean row, mishap and chaos of well-seeming forms, cold, fire, still waking, sleep, and so on. If the variant reading was amended at a late stage in the poem's transmission, we cannot, in accordance with what I intend to show in the following, expect it to bear on the conceptual framework of archaic poetry. Most scholars, including Simplicius himself, studying and commenting on the physical doctrines of Parmenides and Empedocles in the wake of Plato and Aristotle, relied heavily on the distinction between poetry and philosophy. In short, prose is thought to equal truthful clarity, poetry deceptive obscurity. This is an irksome trend, in contradistinction to which even an analytically inclined philosopher like Alexander Mouralatos concedes. I quote, "He, Parmenides, can exploit pairings and contrasts, verbal conceits and puns with at least as much relish and often as much success as Heraclitus. Both men combine a philosopher's interest with something of the poet's sensitivity to the suggestiveness and acoustic associations of words." As I intend to show, it was precisely this sensitivity to the acoustic associations of words that motivated Parmenides to construct the irregular form epikykleos in the first place. His incentive for doing so was not a metrical precaution at all, but a carefully designed instance of paronomasia. Behind the facade of what the vocable overtly proclaims, we hear the unaltered pronunciation of another word, evoking circumstances that the philosopher's sage would have had good reasons to simultaneously exploit and encrypt at a critical point in the proem, the undying glory, kleos, of a victorious charioteer. Before we can begin to appreciate the wider implications of this encrypted noun, we need to pay closer attention to how the programmatic verse functions in the proemial structure as a whole. A first observation to be made with regard to the verses 29 and 30 is that they seem to form a coda added to the narrative section of the proem. As the goddess has just welcomed the charioteer, she goes on to present a condensed announcement of the discourse about to follow. I quote, "It is necessary that you learn, putestai, everything." Now comes the two programmatic verses, both the untrembling heart of well-willed truth and the opinions of mortals in which there is no true belief. Scholars commenting on the controversial status of Evkykleos rarely fail to acknowledge its anticipation of Evkyklos spheres, a well-rounded sphere or ball in fragment 8. Surprisingly few, however, pay attention to the resonating suggestiveness of this adjective in the immediate context of the proem. An indication to this effect is the assumption that Evkykles modifies its head noun so as to evoke its rotundity rather than its capacity for locomotion. Truth is thus typically referred to as well-rounded, almost never as well-wheeled. The model of choice has apparently been the archaic use of Evkyklos as a modifier of aspis, shield, whereas the equally archaic use of Evkyklos as a modifier of nouns denoting wheeled vehicles has been curiously neglected in reference to a passage that repeatedly evokes transport and rotation. Another decisive observation to be made with regard to the oxymoronic conjunction Evkykles atremes is that it recalls the image of a revolving structure with a steadfast support at its core, preferably that of a revolving wheel with a fixed axis. This image is in fact prefigured twice in the poem, first in the lines describing the mechanics of the advancing chariot, emphasizing its whirling wheels, and secondly in reference to the gates of night and day, rotating in the hollow part of their fixed hinges. The solid axle of the chariot shrieks like a pipe, syrinx, whereas the door jambs of bronze are said to recoil in their pipes, syringes. So two distinct passages in the Proem are thus strategically juxtaposed in order to evoke an ambiguous sense of stasis and motion, the shrieking sound and steadfast support of an equivocal shepherd's pipe. As the Proem finally shifts to the present tense from the first person narrative tense of the charioteer, however, it is now rather the goddess who instructs the young man in his newly realized state of blissful arrival, far from the paths of men. What then could be more fitting than to epitomize this discourse by adding yet another layer of meaning to the mechanistic imagery? The being of truth, aletheia, stands still, the seeming of truth, doxa, commutes. I have so far only tentatively suggested what a paronomastic reference to the concept of glory might add to the overall message of the poem. A first issue to account for in this regard is the immediate relevance of such a concept in the symbolic universe of the late archaic period. It would have done so variously by evoking the efforts of lyrical poets to exploit the immortalizing power of song in the context of athletic celebration, through extrapolations of athletic imagery in the context of the mysteries, and lastly, as an object of social critique in unconventional teachings of wisdom. In other words, the traditional function of hired poets to establish permanence in the midst of transience was becoming a favored topic of artistic and intellectual elaboration in the 6th and early 5th centuries. It was a concern not just of the lyrical poets themselves, but also of competing players who sought to extend that function beyond the confines of encomiastic performance. Parmenides' choices of imagery resembles Pindar's elaborations on the metaphorical premise of song as a form of path, or path of words. This is a familiar observation, or a vehicle in which to travel. These elaborations gave the poet a means to visualize the behavior of poetic discourse, as well as to establish parallels between his own progress along the figurative path of song and the athlete's literate path of achievement. The poet's crowning achievement consisted in making these parallel roads coincide, for it was only through his bestowal of long-lasting glory upon the athlete that the momentary achievement on the race course could receive perpetual recognition. It is striking to find allusions to this logic of athletic laudation in the coded language of the so-called Orphic gold leaves, as suggested both by the content and funerary context of these texts. They were intended to guide initiates into the Dionysian mysteries on their journey through the netherworld. Consider the example in handout Roman 2. I have flown out of the heavy, difficult circle. I have approached the longed-for crown with swift feet. I have happy and blessed. You will be a god instead of a mortal. A kid, I fell into milk. I drew special attention to the sense of finality and purpose attached to the athlete's longed-for crown, as opposed to the toilsome reiterations of a wheel, possibly indicating the hardships of transmigration. A final matter to be dealt with before we can return to the specifics of Parmenides' verse is the ambiguous stance on the attainment of glory in philosophical discourse. And once more, Roman 2, the examples there. Plato in Phaedo exploits the athletic metaphor in full when he conceives the afterlife abodes of philosophers as a prize of contests, athlon. A related topos in your handout, Roman 3, is inserted in the famous allegory of the soul's journey in Phaedros, where the most desirable destination of the soul is imagined as a semi-Elysian region beyond the heavens, still unsung by the poets, referred to as a plane or field of truth, aletheis pedion. As exemplified here, the philosopher's truth, literally denoting that which does not escape notice, privative plus let, does not merely accommodate the poet's glory by implication of its semantics, that is, with regard to the precautionary measure of granting someone unfading repute. Equally significant is the eschatological sense in which truth comes to define a desirable location on a par with the champion's athlon. A comparable tendency to correlate the imperishable quality of the poet's glory with that of a specified location is evidenced by the following citation from an Orphic poem, in your handout, Roman 3, he Phaeton established for immortals an imperishable dwelling, domos aptitos. This logic of correlation would seem to imply that the truthful imperishable dwelling of which poets and philosophers speak is congruous with the truthful imperishable discourse in which it occurs. Lastly, we need to recall that the concepts of kleos and aletheia were not yet fixed to any distinguishable genres by the late archaic period, but that they seem to have migrated freely between texts identified only in later scholarship as the works of poets and philosophers, respectively. Look in your handout, Roman 4, the examples there. Let us move back to Parmenides' programmatic verse 29 and examine in closer detail the impulse and poetic license of its author to ambiguously and non-consecutively encrypt the noun kleos. Iliad 9:413, which is not in your handout, but you see it here behind me, is the locus classicus for any discussions of heroic glory in Homer. Achilles, in famously recalling the words of his mother Thetis, captures the gist of Homeric epic as a whole by evoking the incommutability of the happy longevity to ensue from one's return home, nostos, and the imperishable glory, kleos aptiton, to ensue from death in battle. Destroyed then is my return, but imperishable glory shall be. O letomen moi nostos atar kleos aptiton estai. It seems feasible that it was precisely upon this famous verse that Parmenides grafted his own prophylactic solution to the dilemma of epic fate. At the vital core of truth and in its purest exposure to thought, imperishable being is in itself a point of return from the wanderings of unreason. Notice how the new verse fits into the formulaic slot of the Homeric verse and how the original distribution of initial vowels is retained. Another noteworthy parallel, which is not in your handout, occurs in the verses Iliad 23, 647 to 9, characterizing the heart or seat of feelings, etor, which is also in the verse, as an organ particularly sensitive to the arresting force of memory, of that which does not escape notice, and hence, by extension and etymological implication, truth. My heart, I quote, etor, is glad at how you always keep me in mind, mev menesomai, as being gentle, and I do not escape your notice, ode selato, as regards to the honor, etc. Discussions of Parmenides' proem against the background of Indo-European poetics have been relatively scanty. Marcello Durante and more recently Martin West drew attention to inherited features of the proem's cosmological setting and the poet's choices of metaphor, the path of song, yet to nothing that has direct bearing on the significance of praise and paronomasia in the broader context of Indo-European linguistic ideology. I believe that Parmenides' this parallel anaphonic evocation of kykles and kleos, that is, if it is genuine, if it was intentional, elaborates on such a theme. My prime example in support of this claim is the following perfectly straightforward expression in one of the oldest collections of Indo-European poetry, the sixth book of the Rigveda. In your handout, Roman 5, I quote from Jamison and Brereton's translation: the chariot horses should convey Indra on the chariot with good wheels, elliptically, suchakri, as they are charging straight on toward a fame, Shrava. I'm not the first to observe that Greek uses of evkyklos, including Parmenides' variant coinage, could rest on an inherited Indo-European expression, sou kweklos. My point in doing so here is rather to show that the poetic tendency to correlate the adjective sou kweklos, in elliptic reference to a speeding chariot, with the noun kleos, may in itself be conceived as part of the tradition from which the two otherwise unrelated cognates Suchakra Evkyklos and Shravas Kleos derive. Their logic of correlation is testimony to the inherited pragmatics of poetic praise. Furthermore, there is ample evidence in the Rigveda to suggest a strong sense of affinity between the imperishable glory achieved upon arrival and the imperishable otherworldly places of which the poet sings. In a hymn addressed to Soma Pavamana, in your handout, Roman 3, the poet aspires to go, or rather to be placed, by the god where the inexhaustible light is in the immortal, imperishable world. Amrita Loka Akshita. Parmenides' wordplay is another stylistic trait linked to the deep past of verbal art. While Ferdinand de Saussure was certainly being a bit overdramatic when assuming that the very principle of Indo-European poetry consisted in the secret reproduction of sacred names, the principles of encryption for which he sought evidence in his abandoned Cahiers d'Anagram have been successfully pursued by a few notable scholars more recently. At least two of them are here with us today, as exemplified by the principle of the Saussurian so-called diphon. Poetic speech has the capacity to violate the two most fundamental principles of habitual language. That is, one, the codified bond between the signifier and its signified, and two, the linearity of the signifiers. If ordinary language is characterized by continuously representing one unambiguous sign at a time, poetic language may obey altogether different rules in its deployment of sound and sense. An encrypted so-called word theme, mot tem, can thus effectively be said to exist in another time, or rather outside the consecutiveness of ordinary language. The words and words of poetry are no longer what they ordinarily seem to be, yet this need not make them less real or truthful. Parmenides cannot have been indifferent to such poetic perceptions. His willingness to exploit the potentials of language was not just a superficial add-on to the proper execution of logical reasoning. Let us not forget that he equated travel towards truth with words, that the way to truth is by means of logos. More importantly still, and as intimated in one of the Proem's most difficult and disputed lines, he may even have sought to equate saying and thinking with being. Since the question of what it means to be enters philosophical discourse in the form of poetry, philosophers cannot afford to cease asking what that question is to mean in poetry. And now, lastly, I will soon finish. In your handout, Romans 6, I call attention to a possible trace of the encrypted noun in one of the texts least expected to contain it. Clement of Alexandria, in his Stromates, quotes the two verses 29-30 from the Proem in almost exactly the same form as we have them in Sextus Empiricus's complete citation of the Proem, that is, with empatios instead of the contested reading supplied by Simplicius. One is, however, struck by the apparent repercussions of Simplicius's reading in the textual surroundings of Clement's citation. Clement begins the passage by comparing the twofold species of the peripatetic teachings, the one called probable and the one called knowable, with similar distinctions made in works of early philosophy. First by quoting a conspicuously encomiastic passage from the beginning of Empedocles' poem, then by quoting Heraclitus' adaptation of the formula, which is also in Simonides, kleos ainaion, and lastly by quoting the 2 verses from Parmenides' Proem. Interestingly, the pre-Aristotelian distinction to which he initially refers is not the expected one between doxa and aletheia, but between doxa on the one hand and eukleia, good repute, and aletheia on the other. While the contiguity of epic kleos and philosophical aletheia no longer spoke directly to Clement from Parmenides' verse, it apparently suggested itself to him by force of context and intrinsic implication. His stated purpose for placing Heraclitus' formula kleos ainaion on an equal footing with Parmenides' aletheia ev peites is so striking in its consonance with aletheia ev kykles, apote ev kleias kai aletheias, that it inclines one to posit the nonce word as a subsistent factor in the parallel transmission of the 2 formulas. If the pairing of the formulas predated Clement, it was perhaps originally intended to overcome some of the most glaring discrepancies between the Ionian and Eleatic schools of thought in reference to a singular item of common concern, the undying essence of truth. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Thank you for your talk, which I really liked. And I have it's not a question; it's more a possible connection. I don't know about this theme of like it's interesting how sometimes you have very often this connection between luminosity, because Parmenides connected with the daughter of the sun,
Yeah.
and Kleos, and the whole thing I was thinking about during your presentation was this passage by Bacchylides, in which you have that the word is actually arete, is associated with light. It's called pacifier, and it is represented in a way which looks like a celestial body. It says that it goes around the heaven, and but by means of akamata doxa, and in this context, like in Bacchylides, doxa
Means
is the
fame.
word for means already is
Of course, yeah.
the metrical
It has,
format to say kleos.
Yes.
And this is interesting because in the riddle hymn of the Rig Veda, this resembles a little bit this chakra ratasya, which might be the sun, because it's the chakram ratasya is
Yes,
it's
yes.
of course the wheel of the rata, but it's described as untiring and
You've written about that, haven't you? Yeah.
I don't think I'm not sure it's in my article, but I believe that it's very close to this, and this association with Kleos, I mean, would fit very well in your pattern, and about the connections of, I mean, you have, I think there are this association between Orphic and Greek pre-Socratic, but also lyric poets such as Bacchylides. I think for Bacchylides we have less examples. We have more examples in Pindar, which sometimes he mentions a particular image in an ode because he knew, or because he's I don't know, winking at the usage of the Patronus person he's celebrating. It's very common, like Isthmian 8. I believe there is another case in Pythian 3, but it's very difficult to prove. But I mean, I think it would fit very well to your system. So as I said, it was not a question. This was more a comment.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for your nice paper. Just one point to add to your point, Roman 6. Yeah, in the same line as Theocles, you can also include Vedic or Vedic Satya
Yeah.
Shravas. Yeah, it's the same, yeah?
I know, yes, you're right.
Oh.
You're perfectly right. Of course, the Satya part is not etymologically related with the, but semantically it fits. Yes,
The one who has
right.
glory, which is true.
True. Yes, yeah, you're
Probably
right.
there are more than this, yeah?
You're right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? If not, next speaker. And our next speaker, well, clear the stage first. Our next speaker is Lucien Van Beek.
We have a presentation? No. Okay.
There's a handout.
We'd rather have that.
We try to distribute handouts before. Does everybody else have one about religiō? You don't know?
Yeah, everyone has a handout. Am I audible in the back like this? Yeah. All right. So, at a conference on Indo-European religion and poetics, it didn't seem inappropriate to me to speak on the origins of the word religion. And the etymology of Latin religiō is still debated, as appears from Michiel de Vaan's etymological dictionary. He lists religio under the entry ligare, but he notes that the appurtenance is uncertain, without giving any further comment. This is actually quite surprising, given the more obvious possibility that religio derives from legere, and all the more so since this connection has been defended since antiquity. But before proceeding any further, let's first briefly consider some facts about the lexical meanings of religio. This is handout number 1. In Ciceronian Latin, religio may mean something like care for the gods. This is shown in the first 2 quotes on the handout. In the first, Cicero connects religio with the giving of attention and care, curam caerimoniamque, by men to the gods. In the second, Cicero uses religio as a shorthand for the frequent phrase religio deorum, and by adding it est cultu deorum to the word religione, he makes it clear, I think, that he is speaking about religio in this frequent technical sense. So in this sense, religio refers to the meticulous precision that is demanded in the rites of worship. But even in Cicero, this religious use is far from exclusive and probably not original. A frequent relic meaning of religio, which is important for my purposes here, is solemn engagement or commitment, observance. This occurs both as an action noun and as a nomen rei acte. And it's also reflected in the derived adjective religiosus, dedicated, engaged, conscientious. So let's consider these examples on the handout, all from Cicero. I'm skipping example 3, which is also a religious meaning. So number 4, non nullius officii religio, the observance of an important duty. Number 5, to take Jupiter as a witness of one's intentions and one's religio, that is, of one's dedication or engagement. Passage 6 speaks of an author who is religiosissimum, that is, the most meticulous or the most precise about the history of Rome. In passage 7, religione obligari means to be bound by a commitment. In 8, the people don't wish to ratify a treaty. It is said, ut religione civitas solvatur, so that the city may be liberated of a commitment, something that they must observe, so to say. And we must also take into account phrases like religio juris durandi, denoting the observance of an oath, or also the duty of keeping one's oath. And testis religiosus, a conscientious witness. Right, so there's a lot of examples pointing in the same direction. Under 1.3, a second important meaning is scruples or concerns or troubles of conscience. And this is also quite frequent. For instance, in this passage number 9, Cicero says that he was not detained from a certain enterprise by a religio that he has just discussed before. And by this he means his scruples. In a fragment from Accius, number 10, this is about Agamemnon and Calchas. Agamemnon sees, he tells the seer Calchas, put an end to your religiones, and he means by this the interpretations of the omens that Calchas is giving. So stop keeping us from going home. That's the basic idea. So this example, where religio occurs in the context of a divination, will gain further importance later on in the talk. The semantic development from a fairly neutral observance or observance to, on the one hand, engagement, or on the other hand, scruples, can, in my view, best be seen as an instance of subjectification, as Elizabeth Traugott has called that. So the idea is that the listener makes an inference to a certain attitude on the part of the subject, and this presumed attitude then eventually becomes a part of the lexical meaning. So for instance, if I pay careful attention to the weather, I may be viewed by some people as concerned about the weather tomorrow. Maybe there's going to be bad weather. Or I may be viewed as just interested in meteorology. So these are both attitudes on my part, and they may be secondarily associated with a lexical meaning. So in view of this possibility, I think it's reasonable to say that something like observance or attention paid to something is the basic meaning of religio. Number 2, let's turn to the previous etymologies. The oldest source known to us to discuss the etymology of religio is Cicero, in number 11. In De Natura Deorum, he compares the derivation of religiosus from relegere with that of elegantes from eligere, diligentes from diligere, and intelligentes from intellegere. For in all these words, he says, inheres the same sense of legere, vis legendi eadem, that we find in religiosus. Now, Cicero's statement is generally taken to imply an etymological connection with legere, to gather or to collect. And this has indeed been accepted by, for instance, the etymological dictionary of Walde Hoffmann and by Benveniste. Morphologically, the derivation is absolutely fine, and as Benveniste remarks, abstracts in io are normally derived, it's not productive anymore, but the cases are usually derived from third conjugation verbs, such as regio, direction, from regere, to direct. Moreover, there is actually a trace of a third conjugation compound verb religere in the form of the participle religens, which is quoted by Gellius from the antiquarian Nigidius Figulus, who in turn cites it from another older poet. And the fragment runs, religentem esse oportet, religiosus ne fuas. And whatever the exact interpretation, whether it's about religious concerns or something else, the fact is that the participial form religens is secure here. A second etymology going back to antiquity was given by Lactantius, who interprets religio as a vinculum pietatis, a bond of devotion, and he derives it from religare, to tie up. In modern times, this etymology is accepted by Ernoux Meillet, and as we saw, also to some extent by Michiel de Vaan. Although the idea of a bond with God is clearly folk etymological, the root etymology might seem quite attractive because religio more than once is the complement of a verb meaning to bind or to resolve, to loosen, as we saw in some of the examples quoted on page 2 of the handout, which refer to a moral obligation or a moral engagement. However, the connection with ligare is morphologically highly problematic, if not impossible. One expects religatio as a derivative of religare, and the derivation from a first conjugation verb also wouldn't explain why the form religens that we just saw occurs too. So this etymology actually cannot be taken seriously, I think, from a linguistic point of view. Returning to Cicero's derivation from legere, to collect, there are actually certain unresolved issues. First of all, how exactly could the attested meanings of religiō develop from to gather anew or to recollect? That is, from the meanings that we would expect from a compound verb religere or relegere. And why does Cicero speak of a vis legendi eadem in all the examples? Does he really refer to the sense to gather, to collect? Well, that's not very important what he refers to, but the point is there is also a third etymology that has been proposed in modern times, which connects religio as well as diligere, neglegere, and intellegere, three compound verbs, with the Greek verb ἀλέγω, meaning to attend to pay attention to. There can be no doubt that this is the correct etymology, for there are three compounds of legere that have a highly particular meaning, which probably has nothing to do with gathering or collecting. These are the verbs that we just mentioned. So, neglegere, to disregard or to neglect, reflects a negated clause, neglegere or nequelegere, whatever you prefer. And this seems to presuppose the existence of a verb legere, meaning to pay attention to observe. Secondly, in Old Latin, intellegere normally means to take notice, to remark, to recognize. Doesn't yet usually mean to understand. So this sense to understand developed later. And finally, the same holds for deligō, to esteem, which may easily have developed its meaning from to recognize the status of someone. Yeah. This etymology was apparently unknown to the etymological dictionaries of Ernoult-Meillet and De Vaan, and the idea is explicitly rejected by Walde Hoffmann, but almost without argumentation. The connection with ἀλέγω is mentioned, however, in older etymological dictionaries of Greek, such as Prelwitz and Boissac. And you see the quote from Prelwitz on the handout. The more recent Greek etymological dictionaries, so Frisch, Chantrain, and Bekes, also fail to even mention the etymology. So after the rejection of this etymology by Walde Hoffmann, the idea simply disappeared from the handbooks. Still, the etymology has been defended by various more recent scholars, most extensively by an American classicist named Henry Wilt, who devoted his 1954 dissertation to the topic. Actually, this dissertation hasn't, to my knowledge, been quoted by anyone, but I found it when I was just searching on Google, and it's available through ProQuest. So it's very interesting that a lot of attention can be paid to a given subject, and it's completely a waste of time, basically, because no one has ever read the thing afterwards. We may also mention an article by Seiler in 1958, Helmut Rix, who is followed by the LIV, Manu Leumann, and most recently Romain Garnier has also argued for this connection with ἀλέγω. Apart from its semantic attractiveness, which I will highlight in what follows, there are two other main advantages of this etymology. First of all, it explains why diligere, neglegere, and intellegere have a sigmatic perfect in lexi, not in legi, but in lexi. And this difference would be difficult to explain if all verbs in legere were derived from the same root. But it's immediately comprehensible if the perfect in lexi is an archaism. Another advantage is that the alpha of āλέγω can simply be the reflex of a laryngeal. So let's now discuss some of the attestations of Greek āλέγω under 4 in order to illustrate their perfect semantic match with the Latin words. The verb āλέγω is exclusively poetic from Homer onwards. It's attested mostly with a negation, and it's rendered by the Scholia as frontizo, that is, to heed, observe, pay attention. And this is clearly its lexical meaning. Although ālēγō, like religiō in Latin, is not limited to interactions with the divine, it does take divinities as its object, especially when it is negated. So let's start with a very important example, number 14, where Polyphemus, in Book 9 of the Odyssey, boasts to Odysseus that he does not pay attention to Zeus or to the other gods. Ougar Cyclopes dios aigiohu alegusin, oude theon makaron. These words are meant to intimidate Odysseus, who has just presented himself to Polyphemus as a suppliant, with reference to Zeus as a protector of Xenoi. In passage number 15, earlier on in the same book of the Odyssey, Odysseus introduces the Cyclopes as a people in similar terms in his story to the Phaeacians. They live in caves high up in the mountains, and each of them rules over his wife or wives and children, and they don't pay attention to each other. Oudalelon alegusi. They don't care for each other, you might say. This actually becomes clear later on in the story when Polyphemus has been blinded by Odysseus or no one, and none of the other Cyclopes actually comes to help him. They just mind their own business. It's immediately visible how close this use of ālēγō is to that of Latin religio. As a positive concept, religio may denote a sense of duty, dedication or obligation towards a god, a fellow human being, or a task, a duty. In the case of the Cyclopes, this social sense is completely absent. As Seiler already remarked, die Kyklopen berücksichtigen Zeus und die Götter nicht. Sie sind irreligiös. Perhaps it's even better to say that they are negligent, not only of the gods, but also of each other. As passage 16 shows us, neglect or lack of attention is often automatically an act of dishonor. What is uk ālēgē? So whoever disregards you, that is Odysseus, and thereby dishonors you, atimai, noble as you are. Similarly, Latin neglegō may refer not only to disinterest or neglect, but it may specifically mean to despise or to dishonor. In passage number 17 from Pindar, ālēγō probably means to pay due respect. So the quote runs, I shall loudly sing a pleasant song, an adornment for your garland of golden olive, while I honor the race of the western Locrians. Zephyrion lokron genean ālēgō. A scholion tribute to or to honor, something like that, and that would also correspond better to its meaning in Homer, of burnt offerings. Although this passage is taken from the Hellenistic author Apollonius, there is good reason to think that this reflects something older. There is no comparable use of ālēgē elsewhere in Greek, but we do find a use of Latin religio in the context of augury. In 19, Cicero remarks that the cultic practices of the Romans are, generally speaking, divided into sacrifices and auspices, in sacra et in auspicia divisa. This shows that religio was used as an action noun to denote the observation of ominous signs and of birds in particular, I think. And we also saw the example in the beginning of the talk, in the context of divination, Agamemnon and Calchas. The same use is found in passage 20, where Aeneas asks the seer Helenus about his journey. Every religio, he says, every augural inspection has auspiciously shown me the right course. Cursum mihi prospera dixit, and the right course is to set sail for Italy. So religio again refers to his inspection of the augural signs. Neither the phrase oionous ālēgēin in Greek, nor the use of religio to refer to augural practices can be easily explained from the normal use of these words within these languages, and therefore I think it's attractive to think that the underlying root could denote augural observations already in the proto-language. If so, this could even prove that divination as a practice is of Indo-European date. Number 5, let's now consider an objection against the assumption of an etymologically separate verb, legere lexi, to observe, cognate with Greek āλέγω, so distinct from legere legi, together. Peter Schrijver observed that neglegere and interlegere did not undergo vowel reduction, and that they could only have been influenced by legere, to collect, because the simplex verb legere lexi is not attested. Following this criticism, De Vaan states that neglegere and interlegere are relatively recent compounds formed with legere, to collect. However, as we saw, such a scenario does not explain why only these verbs neglegere and interlegere, and actually also deligere, have a sigmatic perfect in lexi. So how is it possible that neglegere and interlegere were influenced by legere in the infectum stem, but not in their perfectum stem? The answer appears to be quite simple, for the simplex legere and also various other compounds of legere are occasionally attested in Old Latin with meanings very close to observe or listen to. In passage 21 from Plautus, we read, clam nostrum huc sermonem sublegerunt, meaning they secretly overheard this conversation of ours. This is a use of legere that's completely odd with respect to all the other meanings. And in number, I think this is not 22. Let's see what the number is. 23. From the Aeneid, we read, he took his station on a mound from where he could observe all the shades that were passing along and discern each face of them. Unde omnes possit legere. It just means to observe here. Now, it's attractive to view this meaning to observe as an archaism, I think. A simplex verb legere lexi, which etymologically means to pay attention to, remained in use relatively long in pre-Old Latin, and it influenced the vocalism of interlegere, to recognize, and that of neglegere, to disregard. And it's not surprising, I think, that deligere, to esteem, and also the verb underlying religens and religiō, that these two were not influenced by this simplex, for they don't refer to an actual act of perception, but they have a transferred sense. At the second stage, the perfectum stems of legere lexi, to observe, and legere legi, together, were merged. This apparently happened already before Plautus, because we have the perfect form sublegerunt in passage number 21. It is plausible that legi was preferred, I think, as a perfect form of the simplex, because it was just much more frequent already. The decline of legere, to observe, must be due to the fact that other verbs took over its meaning, for instance, observare. The old sigmatic perfect lexi was preserved only in those compounds that never had the meaning to gather or to collect, namely deligere, neglegere, and interlegere. So actually, I would also like to add a remark about the meaning to read of legere. For this, I will just read to you what I wrote on the handout. So it must be considered whether the sense to read of legere does not also reflect the old verb to observe, to be attentive. Note that the Greek verb meaning to read is anagignosko, literally to recognize anew. And for this meaning, we may compare interlegere. It would make sense if the Romans used an archaic verb meaning to recognize in order to translate or to calque the Greek term. In section 6, I present the reasons to reconstruct the root of āλέγω as chlek with a laryngeal, and against the view advocated by Zyla, that āλέγω reflects an old compound with the zero grade of the tree verb en, in. I will not go into the details here for reasons of time, but I want to stress that the connection between ālgos and āλέγω, which has been rejected by, for instance, also by the Lamberterie, is actually quite clear. If the nomen rei actae ālgos had an original meaning like object of attention, this may easily have developed into cause for concern or trouble or problem, and hence into misery or hardship, which are the most frequent meanings in Homer. So I would like to certainly to develop that argument further, but that cannot be done here. Number 7, that's the final section of my paper. I would like to mention briefly some potential further cognates. First of all, if the Latin and Greek evidence points to a root leg, meaning to observe, pay attention to, it's almost unavoidable to derive the Tocharian verbal root look, meaning to observe or to see, from the same root. The only potential issue is the fact that the preterite liaka, reflecting a lengthened grade root, seems to match the Latin perfect legi, but this means gathered, not observed. We have just argued that gather and pay attention are different roots. However, that Tocharian look, to observe, to see, belongs with ἀλέγω is in my view confirmed in a beautiful way, because we have the phrase Tocharian be laklē look, meaning to suffer, where laklē is the word for suffering or misery, grief. And this, of course, very strongly reminds of the semantic development that I've just posited for algos in Greek. Compare algeia paschein, to suffer, misery. There's much more to say about this, but I have to be brief here. Furthermore, I think it is attractive to derive Latin lex, the word for law or contract. In Plautus, it mostly means contract. To derive this from the root chleg, as that which is observed, which is given heed, taken care of. We can say to observe the law in English, for instance. Interestingly, its long vowel would also match that of the Tocharian be preterite. So it's not the case that the long vowel in the Tocharian form directly points to a connection with legere, to gather. Already in Homer, ἀλέγω occurs in the context of the upholding of justice by Zeus. In 26, a long simile of which the first part is quoted on the handout, the poet mentions people who have violently produced wrong verdicts in their assembly, and who have driven out justice, dike, without regarding the treatment of the gods, theon open uk ἀλέγοντες. In 27, Apollonius Rhodius uses the phrase uti dikes ἀλέγοντες, neglecting justice. In Latin, religio and neglegere take words for oath and law as their object, as in number 28, quoted from Cicero. Compare also the phrase religio juris jurandi that I already mentioned. Some final remarks. The root final consonant may have been a pure velar. That's generally thought, actually. It may have been a pure velar if we accept that the Albanian adjective plogge, slow or lazy, which is from pa, without, plus a form with a lengthened grade, if this form is related. On the other hand, if this etymology is incorrect, which might well be the case, nothing more can be said about the final velar. It might be a palato-velar or a pure velar. Note that the root leg, to gather, actually has a palato-velar on account of Albanian bled, to collect, to harvest, from ambi leg, with a palato-velar. Finally, I think we will have to rethink the etymology of Greek ἀλέξω, to guard or to ward off, and Vedic rakshati, to protect. These may also belong to this root chleg, rather than with a weakly attested root chelk, meaning to defend, because the semantic development from observe or watch to guard and then to protect is very easily paralleled. And this would eliminate one of the famous examples for Schwebeablaut in Proto-Indo-European. We are still left with to grow, right, with aux and gex. But it wouldn't be bad if we can eliminate one of the examples. Actually, note that the Homeric middle aorist ἀλέξασθαι might actually be the aorist of ἀλέγω. Maybe not synchronically in a lexical sense, but morphologically it might just be the aorist of ἀλέγω. Conclusion. The Latin term religio contains the same root as the compound verbs neglegere, intellegere, and diligere. All these are etymologically related to Greek ἀλέγω, to pay attention to, and the root must be reconstructed as chleg, and its basic meaning is to observe, pay attention, rather than psychikumen as the LIV, for instance, states, following earlier scholars. So this is shown, this meaning, by the archaic use of legere, in Latin and its compounds in the meaning to observe. And it's also corroborated by the Tocharian verbal root look, to observe, to see. Finally, I have argued that Latin lex, contract law, and legere, to read, are also derived from this root. The object of the verb is usually something that cannot be changed. I mean, the objects of this verb, right? Something that cannot be changed, but to which men are subject. It must be observed, that is, dealt with or complied with or suffered. And this is, I think, what links Latin religio to Greek algos. The accepted rules of conduct and also man's ways of dealing with the gods must simply be accepted, observed, and respected. This is the sense of the Latin word religio, I think, and the origin, ultimately, of our word religion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't have a handout when you
Oh.
were talking, but that's okay. So I couldn't follow every argument, but I was just a bit curious to hear if you have anything to say about the word in Greek that is usually referred to as the direct correspondence to the Leiden translation, theskeia. The word that translates religiō and vice versa.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the etymology of that word that would confirm this?
Yes, definitely, because the meaning of theskeia is actually very close to religio. So it's the observance of a ritual norm or something.
This is something uncontroversial.
Yeah. And there is a gloss in Hesychius, which is tresko, glossed as noō. So I observe, I remark, basically. So it's if this connection is correct.
I mean, it's striking that many of these abstract notions that we have, also tradition, religion, law, connected to cultural aspects that are not really, physically tangible, are often derived from technical gestures, things that you do with your hands.
They're always rooted in actual behavior, I think.
Yes,
in
very
terms
much
of describing actual behavior. Yes.
Closely related to what the hand does.
Yes.
So to say.
Yeah.
And of course, recollect this itself.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I have a question. I follow your argumentation for the most part. I just have a question about number 3 on your handout that you. So example number 3 on your handout.
Oh, example number 3. So I didn't discuss it. Yeah.
On the very first page.
Yeah.
Because that looks like an old usage of the word, but it's somehow counterintuitive, right? Or how would you explain this kind of usage?
I have thought about it a lot, but I'm not quite sure yet. I have to say. I just put it on the handout originally because I wanted to show a religious usage of the word, not in order to illustrate anything else actually. So it actually denotes a taboo. So religio est, etc. means you shouldn't, or it's a taboo to do this. So you might assume that a negation has fallen out of the clause, right? So it is to be observed not to do this. I would do something like that along those lines.
Thank you, Lucien. Did you give any thought to the metrical lengthening that's usually described for the first syllable?
Well, it is there indeed, but I didn't pay any particular attention to it. No. Yeah. Sorry?
You didn't care for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I didn't observe it. Yeah. Yeah. But would you have anything to say about it?
Maybe it would help you with the religiō, I don't know. Well, maybe. Yeah. There's one instance in the scenarios where re is in its own position.
Yeah, it would surprise me if there were still traces of laryngeal in this sense preserved in.
It's
in your practical reference, it happens that I devoted a whole chapter of my 2015 book to ἀλέγω. So
Oh, really?
I would be
Okay.
happy to escape the fate of this unfortunate American scholar, to rescue from oblivion.
Yes.
If you could rescue me from oblivion, I would
Yeah.
be grateful.
Well,
So,
yeah.
on some points we agree, on
Yeah.
others we don't.
All right. Okay, I will
You're
check
not
it.
supposed to
Yes.
agree with me, but I'm
Yeah.
afraid you'll have to discuss it.
Yes, I will. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, but I think, well, we can be happy that you will be spared the fate of oblivion because you have been cited already by other scholars. Yes.
Yeah, just one more question.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the idea of connecting with the Coherent material. For the Coherent things, I just have two questions. So you derive the Coherent prefigurate diaca from the E grade, the density E grade. But we know, I mean, the Coherent word for father is part chair. So the chair means that the long E turns into a ye in Coherent B. So if you derive it from lega, it should be in Coherent instead of diaca, but yeka. So this is one thing. The second thing is that do you claim because you mentioned the phrase lacle luck, do you want to claim that it is a kind of figura etymologica, the lacle
Yeah.
from luck?
No, yeah, exactly. That's a good question. Yeah.
The lacle, if you check the archaic Coherent materials, instead of lacle, it is written as lekle with a shv. It's always written shv.
I didn't know that. No.
Not a. So it points to actually to another etymology which Range already mentioned. It is connected with probably the Greek word lupelos, or the root for breaking. So the shattered thing. It goes back to a short u, but instead of the leg. Because if you derive the lacle from the leg, it should be diakle. But
Yeah, so yeah, to be clear, I did not claim anything on lacle here, just on the verbal root. I would envisage, so most people, well, I think it might eventually, but so most people, including Adams in the dictionary and the bibliography sites, derive this from something corresponding to Greek lugros, right? Meaning, well, sad or whatever. Yeah. I would envisage whether this lacle, if this is a real figura etymologica, which most people deny, whether it's not related to algaleos in Greek. So algaleos is one of the adjectives in aleos in Homer, and of course the origin of this aleos is it's quite unknown, it's quite unclear. It would be nice if we have one old example of an L stem noun, of a law stem noun, from which an adjective in eos was derived. So I'm playing with this idea, but the problem is that the le it's not clear if le would be the reflex of word initial syllabic L here. So there's more. Yeah, I should think more about this. And as for liaka, well, yeah, we must get the palatalization from somewhere. Of course, well, most people connect this directly with legi in Latin, right? So, thank you.
Okay, no, I think one, no more.
Just an information question.
Okay, let's thank our speaker.
We have, I would say we do what we did yesterday, 25 minutes break, and because we are 10 minutes later, so just not to be unfair to yesterday's speakers. So, yeah.